So again, as I was saying, by 1705, chattel slavery was the law of the land. It was in full force. A series of laws, I would say 11, that I would say were very, uh, 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 what's the word I want to say, uh, that were the most noted. There were several laws or statutes that were passed, but I would say 11 of them truly devastated that free African American community. The very first law was in 1639, and that law said that, to paraphrase it, it said that the Negroes could no longer carry arms. They could no longer carry their weapons, their guns. Whereas prior to that, everyone owned weapons because they were living in hostile territory. They were living in Indian territory, Native American territory. They were living in their Native Americans' land. And so they were under constant threat of being attacked. And so it was a law passed that each family would carry arms to protect themselves and their family. And the law even stated that they would even bring their weapons to church with them. And failure to do that was be penalized. But for some strange reason, in the year 1639, that statute said that the quote-unquote Negroes would no longer be allowed to carry their weapons. That was the very first law. They didn't use the word slave. They said Negroes. The word slave didn't even appear in the statutes until much later down the road. And in my book, I go into that and I explain that, of how these statutes slowly over time began to formulate and to began to produce the desired result, which was a slave for life. But there were still free African Americans, as they call them, free people of color, who were still able to keep their freedom. They had to register every year, have the registration papers, but they were able to stay as a free people in Virginia. But as the pressure continued to grow and get harder and harder to keep their freedom, many of those free people of color, those families, migrated to other places: Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Louisiana, Ohio, even as far as Oklahoma. Many of them migrated out. Texas, Maryland. And the free people of color, for example, the ones who went to Tennessee, uh, laws were passed where they couldn't even marry anymore the English women if they so desired. Marry anyone they chose. They only could marry within their own kind. So as a result, many of them were marrying their cousins, marrying within their clan, within their community. And so, of course, the skin color would become lighter and lighter as each generation came on the scene. But the group that went to Tennessee, particularly Hancock and Hawkins County, they formed an isolated community. They were dark skinned, mixture of, and even because of the laws that were passed, they could not marry, as I said, English women. Many of them started marrying the Native American women. And so there was a mestizo, mulatto, a formation, a triracial groups that were forming. And this group in Tennessee became later known as the Melungeon. There was an attorney that lived in Hancock County around the turn of the century, 1903. His name was Jarvis. He was an attorney, and he began to document these dark-skinned families that were in the colony, that were in the county, I should say, in Hancock County. He began to document them. His mother, maiden name was Collins. She also became connected to this group called the Melungeons. But where did that word come from, Melungeon? There's various opinions, various theories about it, but I have a thought in my book about it as well, of where that word came from. I'm not going to go into it right now, but it's covered, and it definitely has an origin that makes sense. And the researcher Tim Hashaw, when I read his work, that totally made sense to me when I read his research about the Melungeon, and so I would have to agree with him. But for those of you who have not read about his work or know about that, and even the historian Paul Hennig did some great work on documenting the free African American people of color, the families. So if you have not read any of his work, Paul Hennig, a very, very well uh, researcher who specializes in colonial history, you need to check out his work and his writings. Paul Hennig and Tim Hashaw. Uh, so anyway, the Melungeons, that was a group has had so many different stories and theories about where they came from. Were they part of the lost colony? Were they part of Francis Drake's colony that was left here? There was a storm. Some say they were the Moors that crossed over. Some say they were the Portuguese who came over. So many different theories and stories about this mysterious group called the Melungeons, this very dark-skinned people. Where did they come from? Well, it's very interesting when you get into the study of it and when you do the DNA test. In fact, there was a study, a project, a DNA project that was done called the Melungeon DNA Project.